Today we're doing something that I'm sure will be very straightforward and not controversial whatsoever. As you can see behind me here, I have a tier maker list of every single dungeon inside Raid Shadow Legends, and we're going to be making a tier list out of them. So I also have it set up so that we can nice and quickly switch between the game and the tier list, so we can actually talk about why I'm ranking certain dungeons at certain positions. Now, a couple things to go over. This is going to be mainly preference based, as well as some statistics and all that sort of good stuff from the game, right? So there's a few things that I'll point out with each dungeon that kind of help put it into the ranking of where it's at. And then a lot of it is going to be personal preference as well. So realistically, just what my account needs and what I end up farming. And you'll also notice that we don't have every single potion dungeon, but instead we just have this fine looking fella right here. This is essentially going to be the icon that we use for all of the potion keeps. I'm not grading the potion keeps individually because obviously it's going to depend a little bit more on just, what affinity champions are trying to rank up, right? So I think it's fair to put it all into one. And of course, the arcane keep you need to farm for every single affinity anyways, because you need those magic potions, so it's going to be the most fitting. Let's go ahead and let's hop into it with the Iron Twins dungeon. Now, if you're not familiar, Iron Twins is essentially going to be how you get yourself these resources here. So the Mortal Soul Coins. And then those Mortal Soul Coins you can, of course, transform into Mortal Soul Stones. Now, with the dungeon, you can also actually get yourself directly some of the Immortal Soul Essence, which you can then use inside the Soul Merchants to directly purchase targeted souls, which is quite nice. And then farming this is what helps get you to the Immortal Soul Coins as well, because you can transfer your stuff into the Mortal Soul Stones, you can summon, and then you can come in here and sell some of those trash souls that you don't need anymore, and you get a good amount of those resources. Because of that, and how important it is inside the game, Iron Twins is actually going to be ranked as an S tier dungeon in 2024. And the reason for that is basically any piece of content is made significantly easier by having a high awakening on your champion. So if we think about City of Centranos, for example, there are certain stages that are just going to flat out require you to have a certain amount of awakenings, right? So these special rooms, I forgot their name at the moment, but you have to have a certain amount of stars on your characters to be able to even progress through those. And then, of course, other content, even like Hydra and Arena, Tag Team Arena, Live Arena, all that sort of stuff is oftentimes predicated on having certain awakenings on your champion that's going to make the fight a lot easier. So farming this dungeon daily is going to get you roughly 30 shards, give or take a little bit there, probably about 2 shards per month, and then you get some other goodies on top. Now, if you're only going to farm this stage or this dungeon the most efficient possible, I'd recommend doing it on the Sunday reset. You're essentially going to get 2 times resources for the same input and energy cost. Now, next up, we have one of the newer dungeons that's been added, and that's actually the Shogun's Grove. So, Shogun's Grove, basically the way it works, if we come over here once again into here, you have these potions which you can then use to ascend your artifacts or your accessories specifically. So we're talking rings, we're talking amulets, and we're talking banners. Now, that does work against this dungeon, in my opinion, because there's not really a whole lot of importance, all things considered, to ascending these. And obviously, if you're min-maxing, you want that to happen. However, getting an additional amount of crit damage on your amulet is going to be less important than getting the additional speed, attack, or crit damage on your main stat accessories, in my opinion. As kind of example of that, we have my Sun Wukong build here. So we have some 6-star speed boots on him, which are 6-star ascended as well, which give an entire 12 speed additional to this champion. Now, if we compare that to his amulet, he has an attack ascension on it, which is only giving him 80 extra attack. Now, obviously, this would be a bit better if this was a crit damage ascension as well, but the stats that you gain from this are just not quite as good or as impactful as ascending your main gear, and that does work against the dungeon. And additionally, on top of that, there's not really any sort of tournaments or events that are run inside this dungeon, so you can't really double up for extra rewards. A lot of times in some of the other dungeons we're talking about, there is the option for that. All of those things considered, this is actually going to be our first and only F-tier dungeon inside the game, which is a bit of a shame because I think the visual design of it and the soundtrack is probably the best in the entire game. So the fact that it's this low is definitely kind of crappy, to say the least, right? So it'd be nice if Raid came out and buffed it a little bit, or, of course, if they started introducing tournaments and stuff like that into this particular content. Next up, we're going to have the Minotaur's Labyrinth. The Minotaur is the section everybody's going to come and essentially farm themselves some, oh man, I forgot the scrolls. So the mastery scrolls here is what you need essentially. You're going to be farming this so much. Generally, you're going to have one champion that can essentially just carry you through it. For me, that's Queen Ava. And then a lot of times you're going to have 4 other champions who are in there trying to get their masteries done. And a lot of times they are not even full leveled. So you can kind of double up. You can essentially get yourself champion training points while also farming masteries, while also leveling up champions. It is absolutely fantastic. And of course, masteries are still some of the most important content on any champion. And to prove that, we have something like Helm Smasher, which is ignoring 25% of defense. We have an additional 50 accuracy, which is essentially just adding a banner. We have stuff like Bulwark, where you're absorbing 5% of your damage from allies instead. They are so incredibly strong. And where do we rank this because of that? I'm going to go ahead and put Minotaur in A. And the reason for that is if you're a high spender or a late game player, a lot of times you can essentially just flat out buy the masteries. You don't necessarily have to be running through the Minotaur anymore. That being said, it is still an incredibly important dungeon for especially early or mid-game players as you're trying to get your first couple of 6 stars. Having those 6 stars also have masteries on them is going to be astronomical for your account. Now that being said, I do still recommend buying the masteries for your first champions, whether it be your Kale, Elhain, whoever you picked as a starter. Just spend those 800 gems on it and then use that champion to farm masteries for the rest of your roster. Next up, we have the potion keeps. Like I mentioned, this is essentially going to be an all-in-one ranking, so we are putting everything into one. Now, I am a late game player, and I can't tell you the last time that I farmed the potion keeps and it was not for a mission. So, for example, these progress missions or sometimes the challenges will come through and you have to farm a certain amount of potion keeps and whatnot. Apart from that, I have not spent any time inside this dungeon, and as you can see, my potion count is still doing perfectly fine. And this is even while we're midway through coming up to the end of a fusion, where I've been using a lot of these because obviously we have to fuse a bunch of rares into the epics and then the epics into the legendary. And as you can see, I am not struggling whatsoever for the potion numbers. We get so many of these damn things, from arena chests to City of Centranos progression to Doom Tower progression to, you know, they're just dropping everywhere all the time. As you get into the late game, you're not going to be farming these keeps, in my opinion. It is essentially just going to be a waste of your energy. However, when you're in the early and when you're in the mid game and you might not have access to all of those particular places for these to drop, the dungeon is going to be significantly more important. That being said, though, it is still not enough to get the dungeon anything above a C tier. I think C tier is an incredibly fair rating for this dungeon in 2024. Next up, we have the Ice Golem. So Ice Golem is a bit of an interesting one. Ice Golem was for a long time known as essentially the worst dungeon that you could possibly be farming. Then we had the hard mode come out, and then we also had some reworks to particular sets. There are a few good sets in here that players are going to want. So for example, Reflex is still an incredibly good set where you have a 40% chance to reduce a random skill cooldown. That being said, we do have better sets now, specifically the ones that come in from Live Arena. So this has been power crept a little bit. Cursed set, there is no replacement for this. This is just flat out a 50% chance to place a Hex. If you have somebody like a Krisk, an Eostrid, those sorts of champions, this is absolutely fantastic for them inside the Hydra. And those Hex debuffs are, of course, even more important now, considering the nerfs to Hydra, or the buffs to Hydra, specifically the nerfs to the teams. Because this is going to help you put out so much more damage. And then, of course, we do have the Provoke set, which is still pretty good. Retaliation set is okay. So overall, there's a lot of decent sets in here, and you can get yourself through the hard mode fairly consistently with some free-to-play champions like Artak. You can farm food at the same time with him, all that sort of good stuff. That being said, though, I think Ice Golem is going to go ahead and go into C tier along with the potion keeps. And the reason being, again, basically everything but the curse set has just been power crept so hard that you don't really need to be farming this particular dungeon. Really, the only time I spend energy here is when there's an Ice Golem tournament for a fusion. Apart from that, I never find myself going into this dungeon to spot farm it. Even when there's 3 times gear boosts on it, there's essentially just better sets in the game, or better things that I'd rather be doing with my energy. Me personally, at least, I do go ahead and farm Minotaur over Ice Golem almost every single time. We have Sand Devil's Necropolis coming up next, which is, of course, this bad boy over here. So Sand Devil is going to be how we get the Ascension pots or the oils for our primary gear. So your upper row and your mid row. So that includes boots and everything like that as well. At Sand Devil 25, you can also start to earn the Chaos Dust, which does mean that you can re-roll those Ascension stats if you don't get, the roll that you're looking for, essentially. And to prove how important this is, I'm just going to start flipping through some of my best built champions. Don't mind Nethril, he's not supposed to be here, but you can see how much of the gear, especially the lower gear, is fully ascended, especially on, for example, damage dealers, support champions, those sorts of things, right? There's so many champions in here, like Taurus, for example, where everything's just maxed out, and this is a late game account, so this gear certainly could be optimized a little bit better. But if you look at almost any sort of champion that I have built for late game or certainly end game content, all of their gear is going to be maxed out because those stat increases are just so damn important that you can't really skip farming this dungeon. Now, this dungeon does also come with a lot of tournaments related specifically to it. So oftentimes you can pick yourself up summoning stones for it, or chaos ores, those sorts of things, and sometimes you can actually get yourself prism crystals to do limited time summonings as well. On top of that, some of the most popular strategies revolve around having Godseeker and Eerie and then one other damage champion. For me, that is Newt. So you can bring 3 food champions in there while you're getting yourself those rewards. All those things considered, Sand Devil's Necropolis goes into an easy S tier dungeon in my opinion. I think this is a very solid place, especially for mid or late game and certainly end game players to be spending their energy. The rewards you get from it are fantastic. The tournament rewards are always fantastic. And being able to farm food at the same time is very, very nice. We are going to have a couple of upsets coming in here next. The next dungeon that we are talking about is going to be Fire Knight. So Fire Knight Hard especially is a place where I do spend quite a bit of energy. Really, what you're looking for out of Fire Knight these days is going to be the Savage set, of course, where you're ignoring 25% of the enemy defense. And you're also generally looking for the Stun set, which has the 18% chance to place a stun. And then the Regeneration set as well, which is basically like having a permanent, continuous 15% heal on you, which is very, very nice. Now, that being said, when it comes to the Savage set specifically, this gear set has been incredibly power crept. We have so many better pieces of gear out there. So, for example, Lethal set from Dark Fae, obviously Merciless from the City of Centranos. There's so many other gear sets out there that you're going to be farming instead. Savage is kind of a thing of the past. Stun is still important, especially for PvE content. And then, of course, same thing, Regeneration is definitely still a very strong set, especially if you're trying to do solo content and those sorts of things like I mentioned with Ice Golem, for example. Now, all that being said, this does result in the Fire Knight being a lot lower, in my opinion, than most people would expect to see it. Fire Knight in 2024 is an A-tier dungeon, in my opinion. I do still spend a lot of energy here, but there's certainly places that I prioritize a bit more, one of which being Minotaur, and then certainly the Sand Devils and the Iron Twins. You could also very easily make the argument that it is in fact a B-tier dungeon, again, just with the obscene amount of power creep that we've seen on those sets. Really, the only saving factor to them is that you can get mythical gear, but even with lethal gear coming from the Dark Fae, you now have the option for mythical charms as well. So there's not really a reason that you'd end up farming Fire Knight versus lethal gear, and that it's a shame because it's one of my favorite dungeons. It's very fun, it's very unique, there's a lot of mechanics to it that you don't necessarily have with other dungeons. Next up is again another upset that you're probably not going to expect to see here, and this is going to be the Spider's Den. So Spider used to be incredibly important for silver farming, and then of course everybody does need accessories, right? So every single champion that you run. However, that being said, I do still have myself a very solid team here where we can beat Spider Hard 10 in 31 seconds with 10 turns taken. I barely ever farm this particular dungeon unless there is a tournament for it. The reason for that being is when the event dungeon was out, that was just a simply better place to farm silver. If you're looking for accessories for use, you can get so many accessories from other areas of the game now that you don't even necessarily need these regular pieces of gear. And let me show you what I mean by that. So let's take a look at Sun Wukong. This is going to be the regular old coming from Spider sets, right? So they're not really any special bonuses or anything like that. We take a look at Merciless. Merciless obviously comes from the City of Centranos, just straight up better. We have Supersonic, comes from City of Centranos, straight up better. We have Pinpoint, comes from the event dungeon, straight up better. Refresh and Cleansing, both coming from the Tag Team Arena shop, I believe, and especially when it comes to Refresh, straight up better. Cleansing, you could make an argument that it's not very good. We have Stone Skin, which everybody can get from farming Hydra, which obviously we all know how strong Stone Skin is. There's Protection, there's Reaction coming from CVC, we have Slayer. On top of that, we do also have Pharaoh pieces as well, which every single person can get from the guild versus guild or the clan versus clan wars, the siege. There's so many better sets that are just going to help your account so much more that Spider has been massively power crept. It's absolutely insane. And you're not even going there to farm the silver anymore, really, because, again, there's just so many other areas you can get silver these days as well. Because of that, Spider does actually go into a B tier for me. And the reason for that is, sure, you can get mythical gear and everything like that, but you can get that anywhere else inside the game as well. And then the saving grace for Fire Knight over Spider is that Fire Knight does still have those very strong sets. So, for example, Savage, it's still good gear, kind of regardless of where you are in the game, whereas Spider is just dropping you regular accessories that don't really have any special effects to them. Last dungeon that we have to talk about is going to be Dragon's Lair. I also forgot to show you the tier list, but Spider is in B tier. There you go. So Dragon is a bit of an interesting one. We have some very good sets in here like Accuracy and Speed. These were certainly power crept a little bit with the introduction of Perception, which just is better accuracy. Speed is still very, very strong. There's not many sets that rival this unless you get the live arena set, and then the rest of these are just kind of okay. Daze is probably going to be one of the worst sets in the entire game. Stalwart is still very good for damage reduction. I'm not sure if you're able to see that with my head, but minus 30% damage taken from enemy AoEs. We have Toxic set, which is very good for solo champions. Destroy set, which is incredible for the Scarab King. Lifesteal, which is still very solid for starting accounts, those sorts of things. Additionally, the real allure to the dragon is it's very easy to complete. Essentially, you just need poisons or burns or raw damage. Basically, any strategy that you can use to get through content is going to work against the dragon, whereas, for example, you need a lot more turn meter control for Fire Knight, or you need a lot more enemy max HP nukes for Spider, those sorts of things, so it's a lot more predicated on having certain champions. Dragon just says, hey, you know what, if you can do a lot of damage, you can clear me, which is awesome. Additionally, especially if you're farming Dragon 20, there's players that can do it on Dragon Hard 10 as well. You can essentially solo or duo this content a lot of times, which opens up the options to have 3 to 4 food champions running while you're also completing, say, for example, dungeon divers or champion training, or certainly, obviously, the dragon tournaments as well. Because of that, as well as the sets that are still found inside there, I am actually going to go ahead and place it as the only S-tier gear dungeon that we have in 2024, and I think that a lot of people are going to be extremely upset by having the dragon ranked higher than the Fire Knight, but I genuinely do think that this is a more fair and accurate representation for players. It's probably going to be reversed a little bit for the early game, just because obviously having the Savage from Fire Knight is going to be so strong, but once you can actually start to farm, for example, Dark Fae, more City of Centranos content, those sorts of things, Fire Knight is going to fall off pretty hard. And for me, I'm spending probably 3 to 4 times the amount of energy in the dungeon than I am almost every other dungeon combined, which is absolutely insane. So this is still one of the best dungeons to be farming, in my opinion. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree with this list. I'd be very interested to hear your guys' list down below, of course. As always, thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.